All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We have assembled three noteworthy experts on the topic of secularism and religion in France, which has become quite a controversy, both in France but also abroad, because of the misunderstandings that many people outside of France have about the nature of secularism, or laïcité as it's known in France. Laïcité is really a fundamental concept of French life. It is enshrined in the first article of the French Constitution, which explicitly states that the Republic shall be indivisible, laïque, democratic, and social. And it's difficult to translate. This law has been in effect since 1905, but it is essential to the separation of church and state. And this grew out of the conflict between the French government and the Catholic Church. But in more recent times, this separation of church and state has become quite controversial, in that while it's seen as the glue that allows the French to live together in harmony despite their religious differences, some people say it is anti-religious and has been increasingly used to stigmatize the Muslim population in France. So we brought together three experts from both sides of the Atlantic. Here in Washington, we have Stephen Philip Kramer, who is a professor of national security studies at the Eisenhower School of National Defense University. He's also a global fellow, like myself, in the Europe program at the Wilson Center for International Scholars. And we also have from Paris, Amel Boubakir, who is a sociologist at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales, whose research has been focusing on the political landscape of Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia, the Maghreb countries in North Africa, Arab relations, and Islam in Europe. And we also have with us as well Hakim El Kauri, who is an alumnus of the École Normale Supérieure. He's also head of the Brunswick Paris office, the consulting group, as a senior partner. And he's a senior fellow at the Institut Montaigne, where he has done considerable and very impressive research on the Muslim community inside France. So I'd like to start maybe with an update on current developments, with hearing from Amel. What is happening right now in France with the government is pushing through a new law that will update the secularism concept, and it's met with a lot of pushback, particularly in the Muslim community in France, which sees this as oppressive to their way of life. But the government insists that it's important to prevent any separatist tendencies developing in this community. So Amel, could you start us off by bringing us up to date on the current situation in France regarding the secularism issue?
Thank you, William. Thank you all for your invitation. In order to update you, unfortunately, I have to give some context, especially to the people who are listening to us, because, laïcité is really the buzzword when we are talking about Islam in France. But we should maybe more precisely talk about the different conflicts and problems that arose between the French state and Muslims as French citizens when it comes to the management of Islam. So in France, we have been talking about reforming this management of Islam, and Islam has a religion, which means the daily practices of Muslim, like fasting, like burying the dead, like the halal lunches at schools and so on for, let's say almost 30 years, if not a bit more. And the problem is that we always had two main traps, and these debates never led us anywhere. And the discussions and debates around the issue of management of Islam as a religion always fade because of mainly two issues, or two traps, I would say. And first, the traps are namely the fact that the French state has always leaned on representatives, Muslim representatives, in order to try to have a kind of management of Islam. And second, the idea of reforming Islam is also not such a natural project in France. It has always been linked to the political nature of the regime in place and its ambitions. So maybe I would try very briefly, because we don't have that much work, and it's also quite interesting to leave room for discussion later. But when it comes to the first trap and why these issues have always failed, these efforts to reach a consensus management of Islam in France have always failed. So first, the fact that the French state has always leaned on representatives. The problem is that Islam in France has always been seen as a religion that is new, that is not well organized, whose believers have not a huge social capital, who their background is mainly, they are mainly immigrants, but it was 30 years ago. And this concept, this picture of Islam is pretty much the same currently among policy leaders and state representatives. So the idea was really that we need to have representatives that will speak for the ordinary Muslims to manage Islam. And the idea, this paradigm is putting actually the laïc, the secular French state, in a de facto position of absolute authority towards Muslim, and Muslim as believers, not only Muslims and not actually Muslim as citizens. So, for example, the state has tried to impose upon them, upon French Muslims, a foreign management of their French Islam. And that's a problem that we have had for so long in France. So that means that instead of training French Muslims who speak good French and who understand the realities of French society, until now, we are still relying on foreign imams from Turkey, from Algeria, from Morocco, and so on to deliver their speech, their sermons during the Friday prayers, but also somehow to manage the religion and the religious practices of Muslims. And that also put de facto Muslims in a position of simple spectator of the relationship and exchanges between these foreign imams or foreign influences and the French state. The fact that the community leaders are chosen for them led to the total disinterest of Muslims for this process of representativity in order to manage French Islam. So, for example, and also we have to add to that the fact that these community leaders who have been chosen to represent, quote unquote, French Islam and French Muslims are often, as I said, strong relationships with foreign powers, and they are also mostly interested in earning proximity with state elite instead of really solving the daily issues ordinary Muslims may be faced with. So these efforts have been really highly unpopular with young Muslims, especially. And in my opinion, the main problem is that this representativeness doesn't include the idea of, these community leaders are not at the service of Muslims. I mean, they are not offering any solution to the basic issues they may be faced with, like popular education. What does Islam say about this and this, especially about the issue of violence, especially as France, as you all know, has been through some violent terrorist attacks these past 10 years, about simple issues such as domestic violence, not to say that domestic violence is more important in the Muslim communities, and I'm talking about communities in a plural way, because they are not, of course, there's no one and unified Muslim community in France. They are not talking, and they are not at the service of Muslims when it comes to solving Islamophobia, for example. We have a huge problem in France when it comes to Islamophobia. Does it exist? Should it be taken in charge only by justice? But should we consider that this is hate crimes that specifically target Muslims? So these community leaders have proved unable to solve these issues. I was talking with a young French Muslim activist very recently, and he was telling me, Amel, the mosque is not the place for change for us. It's not the place to be active as citizens. We are mainly faced with problems, for example, when the steering committee of the mosque is diverting the money of the believers, because in France, mosques are mainly built by the voluntary money contribution of the believers, where there's nothing we can do, and we cannot rely on these representatives to solve the issue. So this is the first failure of Muslim management has impulsed by the state through community leaders. That is important to understand why we are going through some conflicts around the idea of the state intervening in managing Islam. The second trap is really about the fact, as I mentioned, that reforming Islam in France is not a neutral project. It's a highly politicized one. In the 70s, it was mainly linked to the idea that Islam was a migratory problem. So we had to better include children of immigrants. We were talking about children of second generation immigrants. We're not talking about French Muslims at that time. In the 80s and the 90s, it became a kind of social problem linked to the suburbs and social peace and so on. And most recently, in the 2000s and 2010s, Islam has been mainly linked in state intervention and state public discourses, and also media discourses and public opinion debates, to the danger of radicalization and terrorism. So once again, the way we are pushing for a better management of Muslims recently has been mainly linked to a willingness to fight against a phenomenon of radicalization. The problem is that it put, again, the most French Muslim in a very tricky position, because we are asking them, of course, to denounce terrorism, which they did, and to show that they have some loyalty towards French Republic. But at the same time, they are denying to be politically active as Muslims, or to have political voice, or to dissent with the state on some issues, for example, in the name of laicity. So it's a very tricky position for French Muslims. So, and what I'm saying now, maybe I will conclude on that, and we can go on in the Q&A session, is that what I'm seeing, what I'm observing, is a total withdrawal of especially young French Muslims from public debates that are actually much more controversies than political, calm and respectful debates. They are totally withdrawing from these debates, saying, well, I don't believe that we can change anything. We have this new separatist law that was mainly targeting Muslim, but there's no proof, and there's no the fact that Muslim will represent a danger to the Republic is not a social fact. That's a political construction according to some political ambition, and you know that we are a year ahead of the presidential elections in France, and that is a kind of competition in targeting Muslims as France's main political problem, between namely the current Macron's government and extreme right parties such as Le Front National. And maybe to conclude, I would say that there are a lot of questions that remain to be addressed, and mainly the one that will ask if the French secular state may talk to Muslims as citizens, and maybe citizens who may have special needs, according to the climate of Islamophobia, according to their religious specificities. Of course, I'm talking mainly about the issue of the veil. Or should the state remain neutral and faithful to its secular tradition, and then maybe let French Muslims be more expressful, or to express themselves without having the heavy weight of culpability and maybe being associated with the radical Muslims. Maybe the state should let French Muslims express themselves, of course, first as citizens, but also organize themselves better without intervening. So what we are saying now, that's my last line, it's really the withdrawal of Muslims, which are who are really tired of these controversies and who are not been able to find a way to be politically active as Muslims and at the same time to be respected as faithful citizens.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mel. Your remarks show how difficult it is in the modern context to keep religious identity out of the public sphere, which is again what the basic principle of laïcité is supposed to be all about. Let's turn now to Stephen Philip Kramer. Stephen, you've been finishing up a book about Jews, Muslims, and the French Republic. So perhaps you could enlighten us a bit on what your research has taught you about this controversy and how it the historical context and also where it may be leading us.
Thank you, Bill. It's a pleasure to be here, especially with this terrific panel. So I think today France is overwrought about the problem of Islam and the problem of Muslims. In the 19th and early 20th century, many people in France and in Europe were truly obsessed by the so-called Jewish question. But looking back, we know that Jews had very little to do with the so-called Jewish question. And today, many people are obsessed by a kind of Muslim question, but to a very large extent, this Muslim question was not created by Muslims, and it's not about Muslims. If many Muslims in France are not well integrated in the Republic, and if some of them feel ambivalence about France, it's a result of a series of long-term trends which have marginalized the French Muslim population. And there are 5 main trends I want to mention. First is the impact of colonialism and also of decolonization. If you take the example of Algeria, this was a country from 1830 to 1962, the majority of whose population had nothing to do with the governance of society. It was a bitter kind of colonial period, and certainly alienating. And the process of decolonization was truly terrible. An 8-year war that was really brutal and awful. And almost every group in Algeria, many of whom ended up in France, was scarred by that. These Mian settlers who left, almost every one, the Jewish population which left, the Harkis, people who had fought for the French, the Muslims who came to France later on to work, and the French population that had gone through that, and everybody who served in the army, 1.5 million people. This left just a bitter impression that remains to some extent to this day. So the second factor, I think, that's led to the marginalization of Muslims in France, and above all North Africans, is the timing of their migration to France. A large part of the Muslim population came way after World War II, at a time when France was trying to go through reconstruction from the damage of the war and was experiencing, a great boom, les Trente Glorieuses. And so they came often as laborers, unskilled laborers, working in factories like the automobile industry, and eventually were able to bring over, decided to stay, brought over their family. And then the economic crisis occurred, the boom ended, and deindustrialization began. And a lot of these people, that older generation, were left without much place. They were marginalized economically and socially, serious, and their children were affected by that too. That's a second factor. The third factor is residential. It's the French urban policy played a big role in what's happening today. Before World War II, there was almost no public housing. There was a scarcity of housing. After the war and a great fit of voluntarism, very admirable voluntarism, France decided to solve many of its outstanding problems. And one of them was providing housing. And they created this great modernistic housing, kind of Le Corbusier on a budget, I would call it. The great projects, the Cité, most of them outside of big metropolitan areas that were unfortunately not well connected in terms of transportation and had no kind of social context. But these were created not for immigrants, they were created for working class and lower middle class Frenchmen, for whom they represented a big change, like running water and bathrooms. But they were not a pleasant place to live. And when mortgages became available around 1970, most of that native population left. And these projects were filled by immigrants. Now, mind you, often the schools in these projects only catered to the people living in the project. So you end up having the formation of ghettos where immigrants are living almost entirely amongst themselves. And you cannot create anything more full of anomie than some of those projects. If any of you have seen the wonderful movie Les Miserables by Ladili a year or two ago, it shows what happens in one of those areas. It's fiction, but it's not without a lot of truth. It's an incredibly alienating experience. Anomie par excellence. I think that's had a huge impact on many young Muslims and many young immigrants in general. Fourth is the problem of laicite. And I know we're going to talk a lot about that, so I'm not going to say too much. But as you know, laicite doesn't mean just freedom of religion as it does in this country. It's a range of thinking about how you deal with religion, above all, how you make it into a completely private thing. And it was developed against the Catholic Church to some extent. And that kind of animus against religion still remains, but it's being directed against the only truly vibrant religion in France today, which is Islam. That's a real problem. I think a stigmatization of Islam by many people who proclaim their belief in laicite. And finally, I think there's the role of the National Front, now the Rassemblement National. Look, this party was founded by people who had been settlers or had served in the Algerian War. It's a party that for decades has basically been fighting the Algerian War in France, directing its animus against immigrants, quote unquote, but really against, I think, largely Muslims. And well, it's in the ascendant at the moment. And that's because of the last factor I want to bring up, which actually does involve agency on the part of some Muslims, and that's terrorism. The vast majority of French Muslims have nothing to do with terrorism, obviously, but some do. And of course, the influence of radical Islam from abroad plays a role in this. But one can't underestimate the incredible impact of acts of terrorism, beginning with Charlie Hebdo and most recently, the assassination of the high school teacher, Samuel Paty. Every time that happens, it puts Muslims in an impossible kind of situation. And what you have now is, with an approaching election in 2022 for president, security has become the big issue in French politics. Now, I think Macron had some ideas about resolving some of the issues of the Muslim community. Those ideas are gone. And what we now talk about is security, the fight against separatism, quote unquote, against communitarism and so on. It's all about security because Macron is afraid of losing votes to Le Pen. And so under those circumstances, it's very hard to see how anything constructive can be done to resolve the problems of French Muslims in the near future.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Those are excellent points, particularly in the current political context. There's no question that Emmanuel Macron has been moving to the right to become more in sync with the population's demands for greater security, and as you point out, to perhaps steal some votes from Marine Le Pen in advance of next spring's presidential election. So let me now turn to Hakeem. Hakeem, do you think the government efforts to push through this new law has opened up a Pandora's box in terms of the resentments that we are hearing from the Muslim communities, that this is actually going to be used as a tool of oppression against them, or what do you think is the best way to deal with this spreading controversy?
Thank you very much for your invitation. I would like to explain from my point of view the French context to try to answer your question. First, what is laïcité or the French secularism? One of the issues is that it means a lot of things, depending on the people who are using the term, the word. For some people, laïcité is a legal word. And from a legal point of view, laïcité is a separation between the church and the state, and the neutrality of the state. So it's a law of freedom of thinking, freedom of consciousness, freedom of choosing and performing the religion as you want. For other people, laïcité is the inheritance of the long battle between the Catholic Church and the state. And now the battle is within Islam and the state. So it's the political or the historical laïcité, secularism, with an impact seen as the long battle, the follow-up of the long battle between the church and the state. The state has to be against the new church, which is Islam. And the third meaning of laïcité is the inheritance of the Enlightenment time and the battle between reason and God. And for these people who are close to atheism, sorry, I don't know how to say the word in English, the new enemy is Islam. Because religion is a way to be under pressure and to avoid to be free. So the same word is used by three groups of people with very different meanings. This is the first issue. Second issue, what is Islam in France? First of all, some figures. We have more or less 6 million of Muslims in France, who are, Stephen said a word about this, highly concentrated. 6 million, around 8% of the population, but in around 20% of the territory. So a very highly concentrated population. Second, they are very young. We have very few people above 60 because a lot of them, they came back to their countries of origin, and especially in North Africa. So they are very young, much younger than the rest of the population. So 8% of the population, but 10% of the population under 25, probably 12 or 13% under 18, and probably 17, 18% of the newborn French. So a very young population. And three last point in this landscape. There's sociological journey. This is really a journey because we have 10% of the Muslims who have a master and more. A third around bachelor. So we have now a real French Muslim middle class. And at the same time, 30% of the French Muslim population is out of the job market. And inside this 30%, we have women who don't work, and we have young people without any diploma and who are outside the society. This is the first sociological point. Second, from an ideological point of view, we have a problem. And I do disagree with Amel, even if I do respect her research. We have a problem with around a fourth of the population, and specifically the young people under 25, because a lot of these people, they are looking for an identity. They don't feel fully French, and they know they are no longer from Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco, Senegal, or Turkey. And their identity is Islam. But it's not the religion of their parents. It's a new religion, a religion based on a very conservative interpretation of Islam, and with, how can I say, they want to impose their vision of Islam to the rest of the Muslims. And inside this group, we have people who are close to violence or who are violent. So there is a problem with a minority of the French Muslims, but there is a problem. Last, to try to set up an organization, of course, the different governments, they did a lot for 30 years. But they do feel that there is a lack of interlocutors, because of course they deal with people representing foreign influences, specifically Moroccan, Algerian, and Turkish. But the vast majority of the French Muslims, who are full French, for whom religion is part of their identity, but not their sole identity. These kind of people, they don't want to deal with Islam. They don't want to deal with the representation of Islam. And they don't feel neither representative, neither in charge of the issue. And from my point of view, those people who will solve the issue of Islam are the Muslims. But if the vast majority, and specifically the elite of the French Muslims, they do not engage in a new representation, in a new way to finance the cult, in a new way to launch the battle inside Islam against fundamentalism, the issue will not be solved. And it will be treated and used by the far right. This is, from my point of view, where we are now. The government tried to set up a new law which will not change a lot of things, which will control the spreading of political Islam, but not with a great impact. The responsibility is within the hands of the French Muslims.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Hakim. Let me turn to Amel. How do you respond to Hakim's points about the split within the Muslim communities, and particularly those who are radicalized, who are trying to impose their religious beliefs on the broader community in a way that the government claims is in violation of the law of laïcité?
Thank you. I think it's a perfect illustration of the confusion and the blurring lines between the idea or the topic of Islam management or management of Islam as a religion and the issue of fighting against radicalization. And of course, the responsibility of the Muslim community is a responsibility that has been endorsed by Muslims themselves. You can, well imagine that there have been a lot of initiatives within the most different Muslim communities in order to contain and to struggle against radicalization by circulating a more appropriate vision and lecture of Islam and understanding of Islam, by working with the police. I mean, Muslims are not isolated. I mean, by working with schools and so on. And on the other hand, you have also, of course, this Hakim Al-Kawi, I think, was referring to Salafism, because Salafi have been the new usual suspects in France in order to explain where we have radicalization and so on. First, Salafism is a highly complex phenomenon. You have Salafi who decide, because of their religious dogma, not to have any kind of relationship with the state. So they don't vote, they are not active in local associations, for example. They don't acknowledge the French state as an actor of dialogue, or they are living in France in small communities and that's it. Of course, they represent a minority of people, but they are not interested in struggling or in facing the state in a political conflict, because they are Salafi and because they don't recognize, they can't acknowledge the state as an enemy. They are here and they are just waiting to go elsewhere and to accomplish what they call the hijra, which is a bit of the same thing as the aliyah for Jewish people. So they are trying to go in a country where Islam is the religion of the state. Now we have radicalization, and actually when we are talking about this generation of people who are between 15 years and 25 years, we can say that all French Muslims don't feel French, who are between 15 and 20 years don't feel French at all. That's not true. They are going to French schools. They don't have, it's true, any link or any deep link with the country of origin of their parents or their grandparents sometimes. But at the same time, I mean, they are socialized in France and so on. Now, I believe that identifying one's political participation with what the French state is offering is a problem that is that concerns a much more larger part of young French people, and not only Muslims. I think it's a general problem. Now, when it comes to radicalization again, the new law has been somehow, the new law on separatism and what has preceded these laws, this law has targeted Muslims, French Muslims, has a problem, and mainly through a security lens. I believe that we need, in order to face radicalization, which is a real problem and which is a problem primarily for Muslims, actually, who are not radicalized, for their parents and for people who are managing this phenomenon in daily at a local level. I believe that we need a much more general approach, especially in terms of massive popular education about Islam, not only just for Muslims, when it comes to also containing and limiting hate speech in the media and on the political scene, and so on and so on. So I believe it's not only up to Muslims to address the issue of radicalization, even if a lot of them are already doing so. It's also a matter of state leadership in working in association with, of course, Muslim associations, but also in making it an issue of general interest, and having also people in solidarity with Muslim communities who are also victims of this phenomenon.
Thank you, Amel. Let me first invite the audience to send in any questions they may have, and we'll include that in the discussion. Let me ask Stephen now. What do you think is the reaction in other religious communities to? The Jewish community in France has been troubled by the upsurge in anti-Semitism. Is that phenomenon possibly related to the rising profile of religion in other communities, and secondly, the Christian community, the Catholic community in France? Some people are troubled by the prospect that this new French law could criminalize the wearing of crosses by Christians and nuns wearing their traditional habits. So are these fears unfounded, or do you think that this is the risk is that we could see some have even talked about the prospect of civil war tinged by these religious differences?
Well, I think that the law is basically opportunistic. It's mostly for political reasons, because of the upcoming election and because of the fear in France about security. It doesn't do very much. It certainly doesn't do very much constructive. So that's one thing. I think I'd like to point out that part of the issue of Islam is that Islam is not organized the way all of the French religions are organized. And that's because French religion, as we know it today, was structured by Napoleon. Judaism, for example, there was no such thing as French Judaism before the French Revolution. All kinds of separate groups that didn't even have a national identity. Napoleon structured the Jewish community in order to control it to a large extent. And he created institutions like the consistory, which represent all French Jews from a religious point of view. There were almost no Muslims in France in 1800, so Napoleon didn't organize Islam. By the time Muslims came in large number, church and state was separated. And so you have a lack of the kind of structure for Muslims that you have for Catholics, Protestants, and Jews. And the state has real difficulty knowing whom to talk to. And it also has, and so it's created things like the French Council for Muslim Religion, which has been singularly ineffective. So I think that part of what Hakim Akari is talking about is how do Muslims themselves create institutions that can represent the Muslim religion, and also to help organize it and help to structure it and help to give it some kind of ideological sense that's compatible with French values. It's a very, very difficult thing to do for a lot of reasons, but it's also very difficult because the political climate now goes against any kind of constructive effort. And that's a real problem.
Yeah.
If French Muslims had this, was structured like French Jews and Protestants, they'd be better off, in a better position to stand up for themselves and to take care of themselves. And that's not happening, to our regret. In terms of the relationship of Jews and Muslims, the problem today is mostly a problem of violence. There's a lot of hate crimes committed against Jews, just a lot. More crimes against Jews than almost any other group, even though there are not many Jews. A lot of it comes from Muslims, young people from the Muslim ghettos. It's more an expression of hatred of their own situation, believing that Israel is to blame for the problems of the Middle East, and that colonialism and Zionism are all the same thing. I mean, to the extent to which this is a coherent thing. And so this problem of violence against Jews is a real big one, and some of it includes murder. And Sarah Halimi, who was murdered by some crazy guy who was on drugs, her killer just got off on the grounds that he was on pot. And so, tensions between Jews and Muslims is another real issue, and it's a very, very bad thing because it's terrible for Jews, and it's also delegitimizes Muslims. And that's another thing which, France has not been able to deal with effectively. Thank you.
Yeah, we've got some questions coming in. One is directed to Hakim, which asks, isn't there any concept under Islam of a separation of church and state? Is that perhaps at the root of the difficulty for the Muslim communities to embrace laicite?
That's a good question. I do really think that Islam is that the Muslims are doing with it. So when we look at the history, the church was under the legislation and the control of the governments everywhere in the Islamic world during the history. And it's, of course, the case now everywhere. So there is no separation because the church is controlled by the government. The new thing is that in Western Europe or Western countries, there is no control of the Muslim church, which does not exist by the government. So it's a new situation. And I do believe that to solve the problem, we the Muslims, we will have to find our solutions. The issue is not the government, the state, the French society. The issue is within Islam. The battle between Salafism, political Islam, and the faith. The battle for identity, how we combine a Western identity and a Muslim identity. This is a question of modernity, and the answer is within the Muslims' hands. Muslims are not the victims. Muslims, they have their destiny in their own hands. We can discuss a lot about Islamophobia, about also anti-Semitism, Muslim anti-Semitism, which is a reality in France and which is denied by a lot of people, and specifically with Muslim origin. But for me, the main point is that the answer, the solution is within the Muslim hands.
Well, you anticipated a question that just came in from a member of the audience saying that what is it that the Muslim populations themselves can constructively do differently to change the perception of the French people rather than focus only on their victimization? So I don't know if you have any further comments to elaborate on what you were just saying, but that seems to be something that that a number of people think that they shouldn't focus just on what the French government can do, but what the communities themselves can do.
We need a symbol, a demonstration against radicalization would have been welcome, very welcome by the French population. A demonstration, a mobilization on the social networks. This is a symbol. And on the ground, on the social network, we need alternative narratives about Islam produced by Muslims, French or foreign Muslims, because young French people, when they embrace a new interpretation of Islam, they do think that they have the real Islam, and they don't know that there are multiple interpretations of Islam. And who can spread this multiple interpretation of Islam if it's not the Muslims? And specifically the French Muslims or the Western Muslims. The issue is that we are on the football field, and on the battlefield, we are only one team. So they score because in front of them, there is no one. Because the French Muslims, the rest of the French Muslims, the vast majority, they don't want to deal with religion inside the society. So we need the mobilization of the Muslims as French and as Muslims. And they can do a lot of things.
All right. Well, let me broaden the perspective out to how this is seen abroad. Mel, you do a lot of research on in the Maghreb community and other Arab countries. How is this seen in the wider Arab world? Is this perceived as French animosity toward Muslims, basically a form of crude racism, or is there a different perspective that you see in these Arab countries?
Yeah, thank you. I believe foreign countries or Arab countries' perception is much more a topic of interest for the French government than for French Muslims themselves. They quite don't care, honestly speaking. They don't have some directives coming from the Arab world asking them to boycott or to act in such and such a way. No, what I would like to maybe focus on is the lack of knowledge of, I will say, real Muslims and the real lives of Muslims. There's a lot of fantasy, there's a lot of political discourses, again, that are built in order to serve specific political project. And there's a kind of picture of Muslims have been the main problem of the French social fabric again. On the ground, that's not what's happening. Of course, they have been some confusion between Israel has a colonial power and the French Jews, for example, has potential enemies among a very tiny part of young French Muslims. That's something that happened. But again, this is not with through a security lens that you can, of course, you have to protect communities being Jewish or Muslim or whatever, but this is not through a security lens or towards the idea that French Muslims as a whole, that means 6 million of people should mobilize in the street and denounce this anti-Semitism. I mean, they are doing so in their daily life. They do live with Jews. They do marry them sometimes and so on. So we have really to make a separation between the way French Muslims are living their lives quite peacefully, how they are socializing with very different people, and not, I mean, I have the feeling that we are picturing French Muslims are all living in specific small villages and towns, following the Sharia and all, keen to impose their faith upon the rest of the society. I mean, that's quite a caricatural view. I mean, that's what the caricature really of the way French Muslims. Now, to answer the question very briefly on why don't we have French Muslims ready to take in charge the process of representativeness and management of their faith, I think here again we are totally ignoring local realities. Again, mosques have been built because of the support of Muslims themselves who have been, and I don't believe that the multiplication of Muslim schools, for example, is a good sign of I mean, it's a good sign for the national cohesion in France, but this is something also that Catholic have been doing, that Jewish have been doing. So they are following quite a normal path. Now, when it comes to the process of representativeness, a lot of young Muslims have actually tried to organize themselves through secular associations, but who mainly target Muslims and so on, but they have been prevented to do so because of these community leaders chosen from the top, chosen by the state. They have been prevented to do so because of the enormous space occupied by French foreign partners in managing Islam as a religion in France. And actually, if you look at the current discourse of which I'm doing, I'm a sociologist, I have been working on these issues, meeting with people, with Muslims and non-Muslims alike, and on these issues for the past 20 years. So what they are saying is that we are not victims, actually. That's what they are saying. And we don't want to have the state busy or with our affairs as Muslims. We want this French state to condemn, for example, Islamophobia. We want the media to talk about when it happens, when an Islamophobic act happened. But the problem, again, I think the central problem in France is that it's really difficult for a secular state as the French state to acknowledge the specificities of Muslims as citizens. So this is really where we have to, the issue we have to focus on, rather than putting the blame on Muslims, which honestly speaking, I mean, are quite diverse and we can't resume their situation as the Muslim community is anti-Semitic, the Muslim community is not willing to take in charge the issue of radicalization, and so on and so on.
Mm-hmm. Stephen, do you have any further thoughts on that? I also wanted to raise with the three panelists the fact that this is not unique to France. Other European countries are wrestling with the integration of minorities. I know in Germany, for example, Chancellor Merkel has declared that multiculturalism has been a failure. And in particular, those of Turkish descent, Muslims, there were cases of honor killings that had taken place because, and this was attributed to the neglect of Turkish Muslim communities, where people said that political view was, well, let's let them have their own little community and live by their own mores, but it led to these terrible crimes of fathers and brothers killing young Turkish women because of this. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on just other countries in Europe, how they're dealing with this that may have lessons for France during the course of your research.
I would say that there's some specificities in France that make the situation in France a little bit different. One is just the scale of Muslim population, which is much larger than in any other European country. And two is that most of the Muslims living in France come from former French colonies. And as I was saying before, the impact of Algeria is just gigantic. Like Benjamin Storer just wrote a report for the president of France on memory. And one just can't underestimate the impact of historic memory and the inability to come to terms with the past that makes France a little bit different in terms of its specific Muslim population. The third thing I want to point out is that we all tend to focus on the negative side, but it's very important to focus also on the positive. It's not as if there aren't so many Muslims who've been great successes. Hakim's point about the level of education for a large part of the Muslim community is very, very high. And that can be seen, well, in part, looking at the people on this panel who have obviously distinguished themselves by their educational, political, and cultural success. So, the movement of Muslims to the middle class has been sorely neglected. It's been barely studied. Just a few very good books about it. And it's a very positive thing. I think what's problematic is how that could be swallowed up in public consciousness by issues connected with terrorism and jihadism. And above all, the way in which the government is choosing to deal with it, to focus on that, as opposed to also focus on more positive things that they really could do.
Well, that's a very good point. To end on a positive note, the improvements of in terms of the education levels of in the French Muslim community is something that President Macron has emphasized and wants to see improved even further in the future. But we'll see if he's successful in winning re-election. Since let's have a quick poll of our panelists. Hakim, do you think Macron will succeed in getting a second term? And do you think that would be something that's welcome in the French Muslim communities?
Tricky question. Madame Le Pen is very high, the polls. At the current time, because of the in the COVID context. So we will see next October or November, we will see better the political situation and landscape. I'm not sure he will succeed. Frankly speaking, I don't. It's not possible at this time to know the future. It will. I mean, it was never possible, but particularly this year because of the COVID. Regarding the Muslims, they vote for the left, traditionally, because the right, they see the right as against them. Even Mr. Sarkozy tried, when he was Minister of Interior at the beginning of the second term of President Chirac, to be open towards the Muslims, but he changed his mind after 2 years. So they vote for the left. They did vote for the far left, Mélenchon, rather than for Macron. And I think that at the end of Macron's term, they will not vote for him because of the law, because of several ministers, etc. But if we have an election between him and Madame Le Pen, they will vote for him, definitely. And maybe they will make the election as they did between Mr. Hollande and Mr. Sarkozy, with only 3.5% of the global electoral constituency.
Well, thank you. Well, we're out of time.
If I may,
Yes, go ahead,
Yeah.
Amel. We have
if I add a point.
brief point. Yes.
Yeah,
go.
please, if I may add a point on this.
Your screen is frozen. Hello, Amel?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I paused for a bit.
Quickly.
What I was going to add, I was going to jump on what Hakim said. Actually, what I'm hearing from young Muslims in my interviews and research is that there's a kind of fatigue about being actually the kind of red flag of Islamization and the fatigue from the left and from Macron asking for them to vote against the Front National. And a lot of them have told me, well, let it happen. Let Marine Le Pen be elected. That's not our problem anymore. So I believe that the real emergency in France is really to remobilize Muslims in a political project that won't be too particularly targeting Muslims as a problem. That may be really the only solution in order to have a better national cohesion in France.
Well, we'll certainly be following the campaign and the election early next year as a barometer of what will be the future of France. I want to thank our three panelists for this stimulating and enlightened conversation about a very difficult subject, and we hope the audience appreciated it as well. So on behalf of the Wilson Center, thank you very much for attending, and we look forward to your participation in future events.